think it's safe to say that change is on my agenda. Change for good. And I embrace that and I enjoy that change. I don't fear it. That's the bit that excites me.
Catherine and Anne announce major change on Camilla. William's secret decision revealed. Okay, stay with this for a moment, because that title points to something far more serious than a simple royal announcement. In the scenario unfolding here, Catherine and Princess Anne appear on camera with a major change concerning Camilla, but the public announcement is not where the real decision was made. The crucial move had already happened privately, and William was at the center of it. The difference is what makes this story so gripping. Catherine and Anne are the ones seen delivering the message, yet the decision behind that message had reportedly been settled before the cameras were ready. The issue was not merely Camilla's schedule or another adjustment inside the royal household. It concerned who could approve changes affecting her future role, her public responsibilities, and the direction of the monarchy that William is expected to lead. And that is where the story takes a sharp turn. Behind the polished announcement was a dispute over confidential information, financial records, legal advice, and internal communications. Questions had already been raised about who was approving major changes and why some decisions appeared to be moving forward before everyone expected to have a voice. Then William made a private choice that changed the balance. Hi viewers, if the idea of William making a decision behind closed doors and Catherine and Anne standing up for it publicly makes you think the palace should be more transparent, would you have supported them? Comment yes below, because staying silent while powerful people make decisions behind closed doors can sometimes look like accepting whatever happens next. And if you believe the public deserves to know when the future of the monarchy is being shaped, like this video, share it, and subscribe. Because the announcement itself was only the surface. The real shock came from what had already happened before anyone appeared in front of the cameras. William had reportedly seen enough to believe that simply discussing the matter privately would not be enough. A private disagreement could be delayed. A meeting could end with promises of another review. A document could disappear into another committee. But once a new approval structure was placed before the public, reversing it would become much harder. Catherine understood the danger. Anne understood the procedure. William understood the consequences. And suddenly the three were connected by the same question. Who had been deciding what Camilla's future role should look like before the decision was placed in public view? That question matters because the dispute was never simply about one woman's calendar.
And although you kind of know that this might happen, you don't really think about it very much. Not least of all because the monarchy is about continuity. But I think for my brother, this is something he's been waiting for. And he's probably spent more time thinking about it. For the rest of us, it's more a question of, okay, we have to shift the way we support. And that's what we need to do.
Every public appearance carries influence. Every patronage carries institutional weight. Every staffing decision can determine which causes receive attention and which quietly lose it. A change that looks administrative on paper can become something much larger once money, visibility, legal authority, and palace access are attached to it. That was why the atmosphere changed so quickly. Camilla's side could argue that nothing improper had happened. Advisors could insist that the proposals were still under review. Supporters could describe the changes as sensible adjustments for a monarchy preparing for its next stage. But William had already made his choice. And Catherine and Anne were about to make that choice visible. What nobody watching the announcement could see was the information sitting behind it, the documents that had changed William's position, and the one person inside the royal circle who had been watching the entire dispute unfold long before the cameras arrived. If that first revelation already makes you want the truth exposed, stay with this story because the next part gets worse, and the document that brought Anne into the middle of it changes everything. The first sign that something was wrong did not come from a speech, a photograph, or a royal appearance. It came from a set of papers that was never meant to attract public attention. Inside the fictional palace scenario, senior officials were examining Camilla's future responsibilities under a review that appeared routine at first. The paperwork dealt with scheduling, staffing, financial commitments, patronages, and legal authority. None of those subjects was unusual on its own. Together, however, they created a problem that could not be dismissed as simple housekeeping. Several proposals concerned decisions that would extend beyond the immediate royal calendar. Some involved who would control staff assigned to particular duties. Others concerned which events would receive senior royal representation and which responsibilities might be moved elsewhere. Financial notes raised questions about how resources would follow those changes. Legal comments focused on whether certain arrangements could be altered without additional approval. The important detail was not that changes were being discussed. Royal households change constantly. The important detail was who appeared to have the power to approve them. That distinction began causing unease among officials who believed the process needed clearer boundaries. A decision affecting a royal role could also affect charities, organizations, staff, public expectations, and future household arrangements. Once a responsibility moved from one office to another, moving it back could become politically and administratively difficult. That is where Catherine's concern became sharper. The issue was not simply whether Camilla should have a different schedule. It was whether changes connected to her role were being organized through a process that gave one household too much control over decisions with consequences for another. Catherine wanted the proposed structure examined before anything became permanent. Anne approached the same problem from a different angle. After decades of public service and involvement with hundreds of organizations, she knew how easily a temporary arrangement could become an accepted practice.
Yeah, I think stuff to do with family overwhelms me quite a bit. You know, worry or stress around family side of things, that does overwhelm me quite a bit. But in terms of, you know, doing the job and things like that, I don't feel too overwhelmed by that. Not now.
A new reporting line could become permanent. A temporary staff transfer could become normal. A revised schedule could quietly determine which organizations received attention from senior royals. Anne therefore focused less on personalities and more on procedure. Who had authorized each proposal? Who had reviewed the financial implications? Who had received the legal advice? And most importantly, which decisions were recommendations and which were already being prepared for implementation? Those questions forced officials to separate the harmless-looking material from the sections carrying real consequences. That was when the paperwork became more revealing. Some proposals had specific dates attached to them. Others contained target periods. A few referred to future arrangements without identifying the people who would eventually inherit responsibility for them. That last point mattered. A future monarch cannot easily inherit a system that has already been designed around decisions made without consultation. By the time the handover arrives, the structure may already be embedded. Staff know where they report. Organizations know whom they contact. Budgets follow established channels. Reversing everything can create friction that did not exist when the original decision was made. That possibility was precisely what made the review sensitive. And then another layer appeared. The financial material suggested that changing a royal responsibility could have consequences far beyond the diary. Staff time could be redirected. Communications support could move. Events could receive different levels of palace attention. Organizations could find themselves dealing with a different office and a different set of priorities. None of this automatically proved wrongdoing, but it created enough uncertainty for serious questions to be asked. That is the point where the story stops looking like an ordinary scheduling dispute. The documents were beginning to describe a transfer of influence. For viewers watching from outside the palace, this is where the temptation is to choose a side immediately. But the more revealing question is simpler. Who benefited if the proposed structure went ahead before the process was fully examined? If you believe that question deserves an honest answer, do not just watch quietly. Like this video, share it with someone who follows the royal story, and subscribe.
I think there were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly wide range of organizations.
A public conversation becomes harder to ignore when people refuse to let uncomfortable questions disappear simply because they involve powerful names. The pressure increased when legal advice was added to the review. The lawyers were not being asked to settle a family disagreement. Their role was narrower and more important. They were examining authority. They wanted to know whether proposed changes could be introduced under existing arrangements or whether additional consent would be required. That distinction created a problem for anyone hoping to move quickly. If the changes were merely operational, approval might be straightforward. If they affected established responsibilities or future household authority, the process could require another level of scrutiny. Suddenly, timing mattered. The longer the review remained unresolved, the harder it became to present the proposed changes as routine. Every new document created another question. Every answer generated another qualification. Then an internal communication raised an issue that had not appeared clearly in the earlier material. It referred to the need for alignment before the next stage. The phrase was vague, but the context made it significant. Alignment with whom? The answer was not written plainly. That omission bothered Anne. She had seen enough institutional paperwork to recognize when vague language was being used to avoid committing a position to paper. If nobody was named, responsibility could later be interpreted in different ways. If the process became controversial, everyone could claim the wording had been misunderstood. Anne wanted clarity. The response was that the proposals were still being refined. That answer should have ended the matter. Instead, it created a new problem. If nothing was settled, why were there dates? If nobody had final authority, why were staff arrangements already being discussed? If the structure was only exploratory, why had legal advisors been asked to examine how it could operate? Those contradictions were beginning to form a pattern. Catherine was watching the same pattern from another direction. Her concern was that the public might eventually see only the finished arrangement, not the negotiations that created it. Once announced, the decision would look orderly. The arguments, objections, and unanswered questions behind it would vanish from view. That is how institutional change can become difficult to challenge. The public sees the result. The people inside the institution remember the process, and by then, the process may be impossible to reconstruct. Anne understood that risk, so she kept asking for the complete file, not a summary, not selected pages, the complete file. That request became important because the summaries were increasingly reassuring while the underlying material was becoming increasingly specific. The more Anne looked, the more she noticed that the language changed depending on which document she was reading. Public-facing descriptions emphasized continuity and efficiency. Internal notes were more concerned with control, implementation, and timing. The difference was subtle. It was also enough to make Anne stop treating the review as an ordinary administrative exercise. Then she reached the section that changed her understanding of the entire process. It contained no accusation against Camilla. There was no dramatic instruction. Instead, there was a timetable. The dates were arranged in stages, and the sequence suggested that several important decisions could be completed before a later point when the future structure of the monarchy would naturally become more influential. Anne read the sequence twice. The question was no longer whether the proposals could happen. The question was why they needed to happen in that order. That was the moment Anne understood that timing itself might be part of the strategy. And if that interpretation was correct, someone had been thinking far beyond Camilla's next appearance. The timetable pointed toward a future authority question. Anne now faced a choice. She could raise the alarm immediately and risk having the entire process dismissed as a misunderstanding, or she could continue watching until the paperwork revealed exactly how far the proposed structure was supposed to go. She chose to wait. That decision would later become one of the most controversial parts of the entire story, because Anne was no longer simply reviewing documents, she was watching a plan reveal itself. The discovery also changed the stakes for William. Until that point, he could still treat the matter as an internal review that might be corrected through ordinary consultation. The timetable made that position harder to maintain. If the sequence continued, later objections could arrive after the structure had already taken shape. William therefore had to decide whether waiting for formal consultation was responsible or whether waiting itself could become the mistake that nobody could easily reverse. And the next file she received would finally show why William had to be brought into the matter before anyone else knew what Anne had found. If you think powerful institutions should not be allowed to bury the truth behind polished statements, stay here and keep watching, because the next part reveals what Anne found in that file and why William's private decision became impossible to hide. The file reached William before anyone outside the inner circle knew it existed. He did not receive a polished briefing designed for public consumption. He received the material that showed how the proposed changes were actually supposed to work. Pages of schedules, notes on authority, references to staffing, financial observations, legal comments, and beside them, dates that made the entire matter more urgent. William turned the first page without speaking. Then he reached the implementation timetable. That was the point when the dispute stopped being about Camilla's diary and became a question about power. The timetable appeared to place several sensitive decisions ahead of a later stage in which William and Catherine would naturally have a stronger role in shaping the monarchy. Nothing on the page openly said that William should be excluded. That was what made it so difficult to challenge. The implications sat inside the sequence rather than in a direct instruction. William kept reading. The material suggested that responsibilities could be moved before the future arrangement was fully settled. Once those changes were operating, reversing them would be harder. Staff would already know where they belonged. Organizations would already know which office handled them. Financial commitments could already be attached to new priorities. Catherine saw the same problem. The concern was not that every proposal was improper. Some changes could be sensible. Some could even be necessary. The problem was that the process appeared to be moving faster than the consultation surrounding it. William had a choice. He could demand a private meeting and ask why the proposals had advanced without his full involvement. That would keep the dispute inside the palace. It would also give everyone involved time to argue over wording, delay implementation, and promise another review. Or he could make the issue larger than one disagreement. That was when his private decision began to take shape. He would not fight the proposal line by line. He would change the rules governing the proposal itself. The decision was simple in principle and difficult in consequence. Any major change affecting future royal responsibilities would have to pass through a clearer approval process. Significant transfers would face review. Decisions with consequences for the next reign could not simply be treated as ordinary administrative adjustments. William understood what that would mean. Camilla would still have her role. Her position would not disappear. But the ability of one office to shape future responsibilities without direct consultation would be restricted. Catherine supported the approach because it removed the personal element. If William accused Camilla of trying to control the future, the palace could respond with a family dispute. If William demanded a new process for everyone, the argument became institutional. That distinction mattered. Anne had reached the same conclusion from another direction. She had remained quiet because she wanted evidence, not assumptions. Now William had the complete material, and the evidence gave him something far more useful than anger. It gave him a basis for action. But there was still one question. Who had given William the file? The answer was already in the room. Anne. She had decided that William needed to see the full material before making any move. She did not send him a selective summary. She sent the documents that allowed him to compare the public language with the internal planning. That choice carried a risk. If Camilla's advisors discovered that Anne had passed the material to William, the issue could become a direct confrontation between members of the royal family. Anne knew that. She also knew that silence would serve no purpose if the timetable was allowed to advance. So she gave William the information and left the decision to him. William did not immediately call Camilla. That was significant. He knew that a private confrontation could produce an easy answer. The proposals were preliminary. The dates were flexible. The wording could be changed. Another committee could review the matter. By the following week, the same structure could return under different language. William therefore chose a different route. He asked Catherine to examine the proposals with him. They separated the issues into 3 groups. The first concerned ordinary scheduling. The second concerned resources, staff, and public responsibilities. The third concerned decisions that could affect the structure of the monarchy after Charles. The third category changed everything. Those decisions could not reasonably be treated as ordinary diary adjustments. They touched the future. Catherine focused on one danger in particular. A responsibility could remain technically intact while losing the support that made it important. Fewer appearances could mean less public attention. Fewer staff could mean less capacity. Less palace communication could mean fewer opportunities for organizations to reach donors, supporters, and the wider public. A change did not have to remove a responsibility to weaken it. William understood the point immediately. That meant the approval process had to cover practical consequences, not just titles and formal appointments. The private discussion became more precise. No major transfer without review. No future-facing arrangement without direct consultation. No significant financial or staffing change hidden inside a routine scheduling decision. And no assumption that silence from William or Catherine meant agreement. That last point mattered most. The process had apparently relied on the idea that consultation could happen later. William's decision rejected that approach. Consultation would come before implementation. Once that principle was established, Catherine and Anne had a public role to play. But neither woman could simply announce a personal disagreement with Camilla. The announcement had to sound broader than that. It had to protect the institution while making the intended boundary unmistakable. Anne understood how easily royal language could soften a serious conflict. Words such as continuity, efficiency, modernization, and coordination could make almost any change sound harmless. So she pushed for language that could not be easily interpreted away. Catherine agreed. The message would focus on process. That was the strategic advantage. Camilla could defend her intentions. Advisors could defend their recommendations. But a transparent approval rule was harder to dismiss without explaining why the rule itself was a problem. The decision was moving toward the cameras, yet William still had one concern: Charles. Whatever tension existed between the households, Charles remained the monarch. William could not ignore that reality without creating another constitutional and family problem. An advanced copy was therefore prepared for the king's side of the palace. It was not presented as a request to reopen the entire matter. It was presented as notice of the position William, Catherine, and Anne intended to support. That distinction was deliberate. The clock was now running. Camilla's advisors began hearing that a statement was being prepared. At first, the reaction was cautious. Perhaps the language could be adjusted. Perhaps publication could be delayed. Perhaps the disagreement could be returned to private discussions. Then they understood the problem. The proposal had already moved beyond a draft. William had made his decision. The public announcement would not ask whether the process should change. It would announce that the process was changing. That was the hidden decision behind the title. Catherine and Anne would be visible. William would remain less visible, but the decision was his. And once the cameras turned toward Catherine and Anne, the palace would have to confront a new reality. The question was no longer whether William knew about the proposals. He knew. The question was whether Camilla's office knew how much he knew. That answer would arrive almost immediately, because the moment the announcement was prepared, someone inside the palace recognized wording that could only have come from the confidential material. The source was no longer merely suspected, it was becoming traceable, and that meant Anne's silence had created a new danger. If the wrong person was blamed, the entire dispute could explode into a battle over loyalty instead of authority. Anne knew that before anyone else did. She also knew something even more important. The final page of the file had still not been shown. But he had not yet seen everything Anne had found. That withheld page contained the detail most likely to change how the entire dispute would be understood, and Anne was about to decide when to reveal it. There was another reason Anne hesitated. The document did not simply identify a proposed change. It connected several separate decisions through the same approval chain. That meant the disputed schedule, the staffing questions, and the financial arrangements might not have been independent at all. They could have been pieces of one broader structure. If that interpretation was correct, William was not responding to one proposal. He was responding to a system already being assembled around him. Catherine understood the danger of allowing that system to become normal before anyone outside the inner circle examined it. Anne understood the danger of revealing everything too early. That was the moment the private strategy became a public confrontation. If viewers believe transparency matters when powerful people shape decisions behind closed doors, this is the moment to stand behind that principle. Like, share, and subscribe, because staying silent now means letting the people controlling the story decide what the public is allowed to know. And the next part reveals what Anne kept hidden until the very last moment. The cameras were ready, but the decision had already been made. Catherine and Anne were about to deliver the public message that would change the balance around Camilla. Yet the most important part of the story was still hidden. William had already settled on the principle behind the announcement. Now the question was whether the palace could stop the message before it reached the public. It could not. The first indication came when advisors began circulating the final wording. The language was restrained. There was no accusation against Camilla, no personal criticism, no attempt to embarrass her. Instead, the statement focused on oversight, consultation, and the handling of major changes affecting royal responsibilities. That restraint was deliberate. The announcement needed to survive scrutiny after the cameras stopped. It could not depend on allegations that might later be disputed. It needed to establish a rule that stood on its own. Catherine became central to that calculation. Her presence beside Anne signaled that the issue concerned the future structure of the monarchy, not simply a disagreement between older and younger members of the family. Anne brought institutional experience. Catherine represented the household expected to carry increasing responsibility. Together, they gave the announcement a meaning that neither could have created alone. The wording concerning Camilla was particularly careful. The proposed changes around her responsibilities would instead face greater scrutiny, particularly where they involved staffing, financial resources, public duties, or future household arrangements. That distinction mattered because it prevented the dispute from becoming a simple battle over personalities. Then the announcement reached the public. Within moments, attention shifted toward the question of why Catherine and Anne had appeared together. They did not know the chain of events behind it. They did not know how long the concerns had been developing. They did not know how many documents had been examined. They did not know that William had already decided the old process could not continue unchanged. That hidden element gave the announcement its real force. And inside the palace, Camilla's advisors were trying to understand how much information had reached him. That question became urgent because some of the final wording closely reflected issues contained in the internal material. The references to review, consultation, and future responsibilities were not random. They addressed the precise areas that had caused concern. Someone had understood the internal problem. Someone had carried that understanding into the final statement. Attention turned toward Anne. Her involvement was not difficult to explain. She had access to the material, had raised concerns about the process, and had spent months observing how the proposals developed. She had waited until the documents became specific enough to justify intervention. She could point to the record and ask a simple question. If the proposals were harmless, why had the process become so difficult to examine? If everything was preliminary, why were implementation details already being developed? If consultation was guaranteed later, why were decisions with long-term consequences being organized before that consultation? Those questions placed pressure on the people defending the original process. The response was predictable. The proposals were still evolving. Nothing had been permanently settled. Administrative planning required flexibility. William had already seen the timetable. He knew that flexibility could mean something very different once staff, budgets, and responsibilities began moving. The announcement therefore created a practical barrier. The disputed changes could no longer quietly advance, while questions remained unanswered. That was the outcome William wanted. A clear requirement that major decisions could not be treated as routine when they affected the future structure of the monarchy. Camilla's advisors now faced a different problem. They had to decide whether to challenge the announcement publicly or handle it privately. A public response risked making the dispute larger. Silence risked allowing the new arrangement to become accepted. Inside the palace, conversations intensified. Who had approved the original proposals? Who had reviewed the financial material? Who had sought the legal advice? Who had access to the confidential drafts? And why had William received the complete picture before the public announcement? The search for the source also exposed a deeper tension. The palace had multiple overlapping offices, advisors, and channels of communication. Information could move through several hands before reaching a senior royal. That made it possible for people to know different parts of the same story. William now knew enough to challenge it. Catherine knew enough to insist that the future could not be organized through informal assumptions. But Camilla's side still did not know what Anne had withheld. That was the unresolved danger. The final page had remained outside the material William received. Anne had kept it back because she wanted to avoid allowing one disputed document to determine the entire confrontation. She wanted William to make his decision based on the broader structure, not on one explosive detail. Now the public announcement had changed the circumstances. The palace could no longer pretend nothing had happened. The new rules were visible, the questions were public, and the private disagreement had become an institutional problem. That was when the pressure on Anne increased. She was asked, directly and indirectly, whether she had helped William. Her answer did not need to be dramatic. She had done what she believed was necessary when the process moved beyond consultation and toward implementation. She was not presenting herself as an enemy of Camilla. She was defending a principle. The future monarch should know about decisions that could shape his future authority. That principle was difficult to attack without creating an even bigger question about why such consultation had been delayed. The public announcement also forced another issue into view. What happened to the disputed changes now? A review could stop them temporarily, but a temporary pause was not the same as a permanent safeguard. William wanted a structure that would prevent the same problem from returning under a different name. Without a formal boundary, another set of advisors could revisit the same proposals months later. The language could change, the personnel could change, the outcome could still be similar. So the next step was not another statement, it was a mechanism. Major changes would require documented review. Financial consequences would have to be visible. Staff transfers would need proper approval. Future-facing responsibilities could not be quietly assigned without consultation. That mechanism was the real consequence of William's secret decision. Catherine and Anne had announced the change. William had changed the conditions under which the change could happen. And that difference was becoming impossible for Camilla's advisors to ignore. The situation was now moving toward a private meeting, not because anyone wanted another royal confrontation, but because the public announcement had raised questions that could not be answered through statements alone. Camilla would want to know what William had seen. William would want to know why the proposals had advanced. Catherine would want clarity over the future responsibilities affected. Anne would have to explain why she waited. And somewhere inside that meeting sat the document Anne had still not revealed. That document could alter the meaning of everything. It could show whether the disputed changes were isolated recommendations or part of a wider sequence. It could explain why certain responsibilities appeared to receive attention before others. It could also answer the question that had been hanging over the entire affair. Was William reacting to one controversial proposal, or had he discovered a broader plan already taking shape? The answer was about to emerge. Before that meeting began, one more development raised the stakes. A comparison of the public announcement with the internal material showed that the language was closer than expected. That meant someone had not merely summarized the situation for William, someone had understood the confidential structure closely enough to help shape the response. The focus returned to Anne. Her silence now looked different. It was no longer simply caution, it looked like preparation. And that is why the next revelation matters so much. The announcement had already changed Camilla's immediate position, but the hidden page could explain why Anne had waited until the final moment before exposing what she knew. If you believe the public deserves to see what powerful people would rather keep buried, do not scroll past this now. Like, share, and subscribe. Because the next part opens the private confrontation and finally reveals the page Anne refused to show until the stakes became impossible to contain. The room went quiet when Anne finally placed the last page on the table. Until that moment, William had been dealing with a dispute over procedure. Now he was looking at something that appeared to connect the separate pieces into one sequence. The page did not accuse Camilla of anything. It showed how several proposed changes could move together, affecting responsibilities, resources, and future household arrangements before William and Catherine had a formal voice in the process. Anne had kept that page back for one reason. She wanted William to make his decision without being driven by one explosive detail. He had done that. Now the remaining evidence could be examined on its own terms. William understood the implication. If the changes went ahead in sequence, the future structure could become established before he had the opportunity to shape it. Once established, every reversal would look disruptive. The easiest moment to protect future authority was before the arrangements became normal. Anne then explained why she had waited. She had raised concerns earlier. She had been assured that consultation would come later. Instead of forcing a confrontation immediately, she watched the documents develop. Each revision became more specific. Each timetable made the next stage clearer. When she finally saw enough to believe the process could move beyond discussion, she gave William the complete information he needed. That changed the meaning of her silence. It had not been surrender, it had been calculation. Camilla's position was also clearer. Nothing in the material established that she personally intended to erase anyone's legacy or seize authority over William. Her supporters could reasonably argue that the review was designed to modernize responsibilities, reduce duplication, and prepare the institution for a changing workload. But the dispute did not depend on proving motive. It depended on consequences. A proposal could be presented as modernization and still create a structure that future leaders had never approved. A schedule could be described as administrative and still determine which responsibilities moved first. A financial adjustment could look minor while changing which organizations received staff, attention, and public visibility. That was the issue William had decided to address. The private decision was therefore not simply about stopping Camilla. It was about preventing future authority from being shaped through arrangements that could become irreversible before consultation took place. Catherine and Anne then had the task of making that principle public without turning it into a personal attack. Their announcement did exactly that. The new approach placed greater scrutiny around significant changes involving royal responsibilities, staffing, financial commitments, and future-facing arrangements. Major decisions could no longer depend on silence being interpreted as consent. That was the real change. Camilla remained in her position. Her public role did not simply vanish. The outcome was more complicated. The process around future changes had become harder to control through private planning alone, and William's secret decision was no longer secret. It was visible in the structure Catherine and Anne had announced. There was no dramatic accusation because one was not required. There was no public humiliation because the objective was not to remove Camilla. The objective was to close a route through which major decisions could be advanced without sufficient consultation. Camilla's advisors wanted to know how William had obtained the internal material. Anne accepted responsibility for sending it. She did not apologize for ensuring that the future king could examine documents affecting his future authority. William did not present himself as the victim of a conspiracy. He focused on the process. Why had the proposals advanced before full consultation? Why were implementation dates being prepared? Why had financial and legal questions developed before the future household had been properly involved? The distinction mattered because the palace could still argue over motives, but it could no longer pretend the process had been invisible. The documents had created a record, and that record now shaped every conversation that followed. And that made the final page more dangerous than anyone expected. That is where the dispute ended. Not with a royal dismissal, not with a dramatic removal, with a boundary. Future changes of major consequence would face greater scrutiny. William and Catherine would have a clearer voice when decisions affected the monarchy they were expected to lead. Anne would remain involved where institutional continuity required careful oversight. But one thing had changed permanently. The process could no longer operate on the assumption that consultation would come after implementation planning. William had acted before that point arrived. Catherine and Anne had made the decision public, and the hidden document had explained why. For William, the matter carried another weight. The dispute had shown him that future authority could be weakened without anyone openly challenging it. No confrontation was necessary. A series of quiet administrative decisions could accomplish the same result if nobody examined them early enough. That lesson may have been the most important outcome of all. For Anne, the lesson was simpler. Silence can be useful when it is used to observe. It becomes dangerous when it allows a process to continue unchecked. And for Camilla, The situation meant that future changes surrounding her responsibilities would face a level of scrutiny that had not existed at the beginning of the dispute. That is why the title ultimately points to something larger than one announcement. Catherine and Anne were the visible messengers. William was the hidden decision-maker. Camilla was at the center of the dispute. But the real battle concerned who gets to shape the future before that future officially arrives. And that question does not disappear simply because one announcement has been made. There are still unanswered questions surrounding the remaining documents, the people involved in preparing them, and the future household arrangements that were never fully explained. One unresolved detail is especially important. Anne had found more than one reference to future alignment, yet only part of that material became public within the story. If another document exists, it could reveal whether the disputed proposals were isolated recommendations or part of a much wider plan. That is the question that should stay with the audience. Because the most important revelation was not that Catherine and Anne announced a change. It was that William had already decided the rules had to change before they ever stepped in front of the cameras. If you believe that kind of hidden decision deserves to be examined rather than ignored, do not just move on and let the story disappear. Like this video, share it, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications. If people stop watching, stop asking questions, and stop speaking up, the people controlling the narrative get to decide what remains hidden. Stay with this channel, because the next royal story goes even deeper, and what comes next could make everything revealed here look like only the beginning.